everyone. Hello. I hope all of you are doing well. My name is Shriya Bansal and I'm currently working as a software engineer at Microsoft and I'm also an educator at Level. So now in this video, continuing on our discussion for transactions, we are going to talk about the different states of transactions. Okay. So a transaction while actually being executed goes through multiple states. Okay. And now in this video, we'll talk about what are all the different states that a transaction basically goes through. Okay. So first is the active state. Now, whenever we start a transaction, the transaction enters into an active state where the execution process actually begins. During this state, read or write operations can be performed. Okay, you can either do the read operation or you can either do the write operations. So this is the active state, right? The transaction is being actively taken up and being executed. Next, what we have is partially committed state. Now, a transaction actually goes into a partially committed state once all the low-level task of a transaction is basically completed. Okay, so it goes into a partially committed state. After that, in order to go into the committed state, right, when a transaction is in committed state, it has completed all its execution successfully. Moreover, all the changes in the records to the database are permanent as well. Okay, we'll talk more in detail later on about what is the exact key underlying differences between partial committed and committed. For the time being, let's just go through the definition and understand the idea. Okay, I'll repeat the committed part once again. So whenever a transaction is in committed state, it has already completed its execution successfully and all the changes are permanently reflected in the database as well. Next after that is the failed state. Now, a transaction is considered as failed when any one of the check fails or any of the underlying task of a transaction is aborted while it is in active state, right? Remember, I told you in the very start itself, even if one of the tasks fails for a transaction, the entire transaction is considered to be a failed transaction, okay? And the terminated state is the state when the certain transactions which are leaving the system, right, cannot be restarted. All right, so this becomes the overall idea, right? A very high level overview of what the different states of the transaction are. So you just have to remember the 5 names. So active state, partially committed state, failed state, and terminated state. Okay, now what we'll do is next we'll understand the flow. Okay, this is the entire flow that you have to consider. First, you begin a transaction. Okay, after you begin a transaction, you end all the transaction and you execute each and every transaction which needs to be executed in the low level task for that transaction. Once you end it, once you end all the transactions, your system goes into a partially committed state. That's the second part. Okay, once the transactions are done and once all the changes are permanently present in the database as well, then you go to step number 3, which is the committed state. Okay, and after the committed state, we have completed all the transactions. You do not need all the record of the task of the transactions or anything like that. So the transaction is terminated. That means you're not going to restart anything. Everything has been done for good and everything has been completed for good. Okay. During the partially committed state, it may so happen that you executed the transaction, but by the time the changes got reflected in the database, some issue happened or some failure happened, because of which we can say that the system can also from partially committed state go to committed state, but it can also go to the failed state as well. Okay, and similarly during the read write operations also something can happen which can lead to the abortion of the transaction, leading to the failed state. So this is how the overall structure is whenever we are trying to execute the transaction. Okay, you begin the transaction, right? You go from active state to partially committed state. Both can lead to the abort state as well. And then if partially committed state is successful, you do go to committed state and then you terminate the transaction. From the failed state also, if something is failed, then you also terminate, right? Because you're not able to do anything. Once the transaction is failed, it doesn't go back and retry once again until and unless told specifically. Okay, so this is basically known as the state transition diagram for a database transaction. Okay, so I would recommend everyone to take a good look at this, right? And then we can go ahead and look at the steps of all of it one by one. So when we talk about the state transition diagram, it highlights a transaction moves between different various states. Okay, so we'll go to all of these steps which are shown over here one by one. So you can refer to the numbering, and based on that, you can just check the steps, what is happening. So the first point is, once a transaction states execution, right, it becomes active. When you start the execution of a transaction, it becomes an active state. It can issue read operation, it can issue write operation. Okay. Once the read and the write operations are complete, the transaction goes to partially executed state. This point number 2. Once you're done with the read and the write operation. Next, some recovery protocols need to ensure that a system failure, right? After even the transactions are partially complete now, to go from partially complete to fully complete. Even for that stage also now, you have to introduce some recovery protocols that ensures that a system failure will not happen. And even if it does, it is enabled to record changes in the transaction permanently, right? If this check is a success, if you're actually able to make sure that your recovery protocols are correct, right, and they're ensured and they make sure that the system failure will not lead to any inconsistency, then the transaction commits and then goes into the committed state. Okay, so after you add, I can say, let me show you. Let's take a look here. So when you're partially completed, all the read and the write operations are done. Okay, but when you're completed or committed fully, right, then not just read and write operations are done, but some recovery protocols are also put into place to make sure that nothing else happens and doesn't disturb the overall consistency of the database. Okay. Now, fourth point is, if this check is a fail, if somehow from partially committed state, you're not able to go to committed state, right, it leads to abort, right, then the transaction goes to the fail state if something else happens. Okay. Now, if the transaction is aborted, right, while it is in active state. So I told you that abortion of a transaction can go from active state also and from partially committed state as well. If any of these basically happens, right, what it basically means over here is that, right, if a transaction is aborted while it is in active state, it basically goes to the failed state. And in that case, the transaction is rolled back to undo the effect of the write operation. It may so happen, right, that you did some read and write operations over here and then you go into abort state. So you need to make sure that there are rollback procedures put into place in order to undo the write operations. Okay, and the terminated state basically refers to the state where the transaction is leaving the system because all the states on all the tasks of the transaction are completed. Okay, so that is when you can say that your transaction is terminated. Terminated is like the final state when everything has been done and everything has been completed. So I hope this gives you a good idea on how this transition is basically happening from a state of a transaction from one state to another state. And there's a relevant diagram to show this. All right. So what all do we have over here? The active state is the very first state of the transaction. This is just a quick look over and a look back on what we discussed. The active state is the first state of every transaction. In this state, the transaction is being executed. You are executing the task of a transaction. For example, insertion, deletion, or updating a record. But all the records are still not saved in the database. Okay, you're doing the changes, right? You're doing changes on the record, but not everything is permanently saved to the database. Partially committed, in this state, a transaction basically executes its final operation, but the data is still not saved in the database, right? In the total mark, calculation example, you can see that once you have the final display, let's say you take an example of like when you're calculating the total marks of the student, right? When you have the final display of a marks of a student, right, then that is happening in this state. Let's say here, you have to calculate marks. So you will have to do a lot of operations, right? Let's say you are doing all the operations and then you are adding up all the marks of that student. So now the display of those marks is the partially committed state. But remember here, so far the changes are not reflected in the database yet. Okay. A transaction, a committed state, right, is the one in which all the like transactions are, or all the tasks are executed successfully, right? And now they are permanently saved to the database as well. So only in the committed state, all the changes are permanently reflected in the database. Okay. Next we have is the failed state. Now, if any of the checks made by the database recovery system fails, right? You have a lot of checks into place. You have recovery protocols put into place. You have read and write checks put into place. If any of these check fails, the system automatically goes into the failed state. Okay. Right? Let's say when we're calculating the total marks of a student, if any of the query, right, is not able to calculate the marks for the student, the transaction will fail to get executed. Okay. After that, the final one that we have is aborted, right? Aborted is more or like a process, a transition. If any of the checks fail and the transaction has reached a failed state, then the database recovery system will make sure that the database is in the previous consistent state. So you did some operations, you made it to a consistent state. After that, you did some another transaction and failed. So you are in an inconsistent state. So you need to roll back to the previous consistent state, right? If not, then it will abort or roll back the transaction to bringing the database in a consistent state. If the transaction fails, right, in the middle of a transaction, then before executing the transaction, all the executed transactions are rolled back to its consistent state. That is what just we talked about. Now, also remember that after aborting the transaction, the database recovery module will either restart the transaction or it will kill the transaction. So either you can have like a process where you are restarting from the scratch, or you can kill the transaction altogether as well. Okay. So this basically concludes our discussion for state transition diagrams and what all states does a transaction basically have to go through in order to or before actually coming into the terminated state. Okay, so I hope this is clear to everyone. In the next video, we are going to talk about ACID properties. You remember we talked about a few properties of a transaction: atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability, which needs to make sure that the transaction follows. So the next video, we'll focus on that and we'll talk about all the 4 properties in detail by taking good examples and understanding this in detail as well. Okay, so thank you so much for tuning in this video. I hope you're practicing as well and trying out few more relevant examples to understand this topic, and we'll meet very soon in the next video. Thank you.